No one in that small military hospital in Savannah had ever seen anything like it, and the moment it began, it felt like reality itself had cracked. A soldier burst through the entrance just before midnight, his body folded forward as if something inside him was trying to tear its way out. The fluorescent lights exposed every detail, the sweat soaking through his uniform, the unnatural curve of his abdomen, the raw panic in his eyes. This wasn't the kind of emergency the staff was trained for. It didn't fit any category, any protocol, any known medical explanation. Dr. Rowan Pike had barely started his shift when the commotion reached him. Years of experience had hardened his instincts, but even before he reached the lobby, something about the sound, the kind of pain in it, felt wrong. Not just intense, but misplaced, like it didn't belong to the person making it. When he turned the corner and saw the young soldier, everything inside him stalled for half a second. The man, identified moments later as Corbin Voss, looked no older than 25. His face was pale, jaw clenched, veins standing out along his neck. But none of that was what froze the doctor. It was the stomach. Round. Distended. Fully extended like someone at the final stage of pregnancy. Not bloated. Not swollen from injury. Something far more structured. Defined. Alive. The contradiction hit instantly. Every rule of biology rejected what his eyes were seeing. And yet, there it was, undeniable.
Corbin could barely stand.
Another soldier, Mercer Hale, struggled to hold him upright, his own face twisted with fear and confusion. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was something they didn't understand, something that had been building for months without explanation. Corbin had been getting worse. That much Mercer made clear in fragments while the nurses rushed a stretcher in. The symptoms had started subtly: fatigue, nausea, strange discomfort. Then came the growth. Slow at first, easy to dismiss. But over time, impossible to ignore. Corbin had refused help, brushed it off, insisted it was nothing serious. Until tonight. Because tonight, something inside him had changed. The moment Dr. Pike placed his hand against Corbin's abdomen, the last thread of rational doubt snapped. There was movement. Not random. Not muscular spasms. Not gas or internal pressure. It was deliberate. A push from within. A response. Something pressing outward, as if aware of the contact. The doctor instinctively pulled his hand back, his pulse spiking despite years of clinical discipline. That feeling, he knew it. He had felt it hundreds of times before. A kick. The realization didn't come as a thought. It hit like a shockwave. His training tried to reject it, his logic scrambled to reinterpret it, but nothing else fit. The shape, the movement, the timing. Every sign pointed to the same impossible conclusion. And that was exactly the problem. Because Corbin Voss was, in every visible way, a man. They rushed him into an examination room, urgency replacing disbelief. Corbin's breathing grew more erratic, his body tightening in waves that came and went with increasing intensity. Sweat poured down his face. His hands gripped the edges of the stretcher so hard his knuckles turned white. Whatever was happening inside him was escalating fast. Dr. Pike forced himself to focus. Confusion could come later. Right now, he needed answers. The ultrasound machine was brought in immediately. The room fell into a strange silence as the gel was applied, cold against overheated skin. Corbin's body flinched slightly, but he didn't resist. He couldn't. The pain was already consuming him, building in cycles that were becoming harder to ignore. The monitor flickered to life. At first, only static shapes appeared, shadows shifting without meaning. The kind of unclear imaging that could be explained away. The kind that still allowed denial. But then the picture sharpened. And everything changed. Two distinct forms emerged on the screen. Small. Defined. Moving. Not one. Two. Dr. Pike's vision narrowed as the shapes became unmistakable. Heads. Limbs. Rhythmic motion. The faint but undeniable flicker of heartbeats pulsing in perfect biological precision. There was no misreading it. No room for error. Twins. For a split second, the doctor forgot how to breathe. The room seemed to tilt as the weight of what he was seeing settled in. This wasn't a tumor. Not a parasite. Not some rare abnormality that could be explained with enough research. These were babies. Alive. Developing. Inside a body that should not, by any known law of science, be capable of carrying them. Behind him, Mercer stepped closer, drawn by the silence, by the tension that had suddenly thickened the air. He didn't understand the screen, not fully, but he understood enough. Enough to feel the fear rise in his chest, enough to sense that whatever they had been dealing with was far beyond anything they had imagined. On the stretcher, Corbin's body arched suddenly. A stronger wave of pain hit, sharper than the ones before. His muscles tightened uncontrollably, his breath catching as something deep inside him shifted. Not just movement anymore. Pressure. Descending. The kind that meant something irreversible had begun. Dr. Pike's training snapped back into place, cutting through the shock like a blade. He had seen this progression too many times to mistake it now. The intervals. The intensity. The physical response. Labor. It didn't matter how impossible it was. It didn't matter how much his mind resisted the conclusion. The body in front of him was following a pattern he knew with absolute certainty. And that meant there was no more time. The situation had crossed from unexplainable into urgent. Whatever truth was hiding behind Corbin Voss, whatever secret had led to this moment, it was about to be forced into the open. Because in a matter of minutes, something that should never have existed was about to be born. Long before the hospital lights exposed the impossible, the story had already begun to unravel in silence. 8 months earlier, everything about Corbin Voss had still made sense, at least on the surface. He was a disciplined soldier stationed at Fort Moore, Georgia, known for consistency, physical endurance, and a reputation that didn't leave room for strange behavior. He followed orders, kept his record clean, and stayed close to one person above all others. Mercer Hale, the only one who knew him beyond the uniform. Then, without warning, Corbin disappeared. It wasn't dramatic. There was no alarm, no official report, no immediate search. He simply failed to show up one morning. At first, it looked like a mistake. Oversleeping, miscommunication, something minor. But as hours turned into days, that explanation collapsed. His phone went silent. His bunk remained untouched. No one had seen him leave. By the end of the second day, the absence stopped being inconvenient and started becoming suspicious. But before the situation could escalate, Corbin returned. He appeared just hours before deployment, walking back into the base like nothing had happened. His uniform was wrinkled, his movements slower than usual, and there was something off about the way he carried himself. Not injured in any obvious way, but not right either. His eyes lacked focus, his reactions lagged, and his memory, at least according to him, was fractured. He claimed he had been in an accident. The explanation was vague. He described waking up in a civilian hospital somewhere in the city, disoriented, with no clear memory of how he got there. A head injury, he suggested. Something that knocked out chunks of time. He insisted he had only just regained enough awareness to return. On paper, it was just believable enough. But Mercer didn't buy it. From the moment Corbin sat beside him on the transport bus, something felt wrong. The voice was the same, the face identical, but the rhythm was different. Subtle delays in recognition. Small gaps in shared memories. moments where Corbin seemed to hesitate before responding, as if searching for the right version of himself to present. At first, Mercer blamed the injury. Memory loss could explain a lot. Disorientation, emotional distance, even personality shifts. But as the hours passed, that explanation began to crack. Corbin wasn't just forgetting things. He was avoiding them. Conversations about the past were redirected or shortened. Questions about specific events were met with vague responses. Even physical habits had changed. Corbin, who used to move with sharp precision, now seemed more cautious, almost guarded, as if constantly aware of being observed. And then there were the physical symptoms. They started quietly. A slight loss of appetite. Occasional nausea that Corbin dismissed as stress. Fatigue that seemed disproportionate to the workload. None of it alarming on its own. Nothing that demanded immediate attention. But it didn't stop. Days turned into weeks, and the symptoms deepened. The nausea became more frequent. The fatigue heavier. Corbin began isolating himself more often, avoiding group routines, especially anything that required changing or exposing his body. What used to be casual, locker rooms, shared showers, became situations he carefully avoided. Mercer noticed all of it. He also noticed the change in Corbin's body. At first, it was subtle. A slight rounding at the midsection, easy to overlook. Training conditions were rough, diet inconsistent. There were reasonable explanations. But the change didn't match Corbin's discipline. He had always been strict with his fitness. His body had never fluctuated like that. And yet, it continued. The shape became more defined. Not just weight gain. Not random.
Strukturet.
Centered. Gradual, but steady. Mercer's concern grew, but every attempt to push for answers hit the same wall. Corbin insisted it was nothing serious. A digestive issue. Water retention. Anything but something worth reporting. But beneath that insistence, there was something else. Fear. Not the kind that came from physical discomfort, but something deeper. Something Corbin wasn't willing to say out loud. It showed in the way he touched his stomach when he thought no one was looking. In the way his eyes lingered on nothing, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. And then came the moment that shifted everything. During a routine movement through dense terrain in Louisiana, under suffocating heat and humidity, Corbin suddenly stopped. His body tensed, his hand pressing against his abdomen with a reflex that wasn't casual. It wasn't discomfort. It was reaction. Mercer saw it clearly. A flicker of panic crossed Corbin's face before he forced it down. The moment passed quickly, dismissed again as nothing serious. But it wasn't nothing. Because Mercer had seen the movement. Not from Corbin. From inside him. It was brief. Subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it. A shift beneath the fabric. A ripple that didn't match breathing or muscle contraction. Something moved. That was the moment doubt turned into certainty. Whatever Corbin was hiding, it wasn't just an injury. It wasn't just memory loss. It was something physical. Something growing. Something that didn't belong inside any explanation Mercer could accept. From that point on, everything Corbin did felt like part of a larger concealment. He avoided medical checkups entirely, even when others were required to attend. He changed routines, altered schedules, and kept himself just distant enough to prevent close inspection. The more his condition advanced, the more deliberate his behavior became. And yet, despite all of that control, his body kept changing. The growth accelerated. By the third month in the field, it was no longer something that could be ignored. Other soldiers began to notice. Comments started quietly, then spread. Speculation filled the gaps left by silence. No one had an explanation, but everyone could see something was wrong. Still, Corbin refused help. Even as the signs became undeniable, he held his ground, clinging to the same thin excuses, as if admitting the truth would trigger something far worse than the condition itself. And in a way, he was right. Because what no one knew, what Corbin was protecting at all costs, was that the truth wasn't just about his body. It was about what had happened the night he disappeared. It was about the people who had expected him never to return. And it was about the fact that whatever was growing inside him wasn't the only secret waiting to come out. By the time the third month in the Louisiana wilderness came to an end, whatever had begun inside Corbin Voss could no longer be disguised as coincidence, illness, or stress. It had crossed a line, visible, undeniable, and deeply unsettling to everyone around him. The training conditions were already extreme. Heat pressed down like a constant weight, insects swarmed without mercy, and every soldier was pushed to the edge of endurance. Under those circumstances, weakness revealed itself quickly. But what was happening to Corbin didn't follow the rules of fatigue or injury. It followed its own pattern. His body was changing in ways that no one could explain. The growth in his abdomen had become structured, rounded with unnatural precision. It wasn't bloating. It wasn't inconsistent. It was progressive, measured, almost deliberate. Each day added something new, something heavier, something that forced him to adjust how he moved, how he stood, even how he breathed. And still, he refused to break. Corbin adapted in silence. He shifted his posture to hide the weight. He timed his movements to avoid drawing attention. He positioned himself at angles that concealed the outline beneath his uniform. Every action became calculated, controlled, as if he were constantly one step away from being exposed. But control was slipping. The physical strain was increasing faster than he could manage. His endurance dropped. His balance shifted. Long marches that once meant nothing now left him lagging behind. The smallest inclinations in terrain forced him to pause, to steady himself, to recover in ways that didn't match the soldier he used to be. Mercer Hale watched all of it. What had started as concern had turned into something sharper, certainty mixed with fear. He had known Corbin long enough to recognize every habit, every reflex. This wasn't a temporary condition. This wasn't recovery from injury. This was transformation. And the more Mercer observed, the more one thought refused to leave his mind. Something was alive in there. The idea didn't make sense. It couldn't. But the evidence kept building. The way Corbin reacted to certain movements. The way his hand instinctively guarded his abdomen. The way his breathing changed at specific moments, as if responding to something internal rather than external strain. Then came the day that confirmed it. They were moving through a dense stretch of forest, visibility low, humidity suffocating. The group maintained a steady pace, focused on completing the route before nightfall. Corbin had been holding his position, slower than usual but still keeping up. Until he didn't. Without warning, his body stopped. Not from exhaustion. Not from injury. It was abrupt, reactive, as if something inside him had forced the halt. His hand snapped to his abdomen, fingers pressing hard against the fabric of his uniform. His entire posture shifted, defensive, protective. Mercer turned immediately. What he saw in that moment erased every remaining doubt. The movement came from beneath the surface, subtle but unmistakable. A controlled push outward, followed by a slight recoil. It wasn't random. It wasn't muscle. It was intentional. Alive. Corbin felt it too. That much was clear. His face tightened for a fraction of a second before he forced control back over himself. The reaction was suppressed almost instantly, but it had already happened. It had already been seen. From that point on, nothing could return to normal. Mercer didn't confront him, not directly. The situation had moved beyond simple questioning. Whatever Corbin was hiding, it wasn't something he was ready to admit, and pushing too hard could break whatever fragile control he still had. But silence didn't mean ignorance. Mercer began watching more closely, tracking patterns, noticing details others missed. The timing of Corbin's discomfort. The frequency of his isolation. The way he avoided contact whenever possible. Every piece added to a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. And they weren't the only ones paying attention. Captain Thayer Vance and Sergeant Hollis Creed had been observing from a distance, their interest far less subtle and far more dangerous. Unlike Mercer, their concern wasn't about Corbin's well-being. It was about risk. Because Corbin wasn't supposed to be there. They had seen him die. Or at least, they had made sure he should have. The memory of that night lingered between them, unspoken but never forgotten. The blow to the head. The fall. The water. Every step had been calculated, final. There had been no room for survival. And yet there he was. Walking. Breathing. Changing. At first, they had convinced themselves it was temporary, that whatever memory Corbin had lost would keep him harmless. But as weeks passed, doubt returned. Memory could come back. And if it did, everything they had done would come with consequences they couldn't control. So they adapted. Their approach became quieter, more strategic. No direct confrontation. No obvious moves. Just opportunities. Small, controlled situations where an accident could happen without raising suspicion. The first attempt came near the river. The assignment was simple. Corbin was sent alone to retrieve supplies from the opposite bank. The conditions were unstable enough to justify risk. The water ran deep, the current unpredictable. It was the perfect place for something to go wrong. What they didn't expect was Corbin's awareness. By the time he reached the boat, something had already shifted inside him, not physically this time but mentally. A heightened sense, a quiet alertness that hadn't been there before. He moved slower, more deliberate, inspecting what others would have ignored. And that was when he found it. Hidden beneath the structure, subtle but intentional. A small device placed where no one would notice. Enough to compromise the boat mid-crossing. Enough to ensure he wouldn't make it back. Corbin didn't react. Not outwardly. He removed it with precision, disposing of it without leaving evidence. Then he continued as if nothing had changed, completing the task and returning without incident. From the shore, Vance and Creed watched in disbelief. That should have been the end. Instead, it was proof of something far worse. Corbin wasn't just surviving. He was aware. Weeks passed, and the tension thickened. The physical changes continued. The growth accelerated. By the 5th month, the shape beneath Corbin's uniform had become impossible to fully conceal. Whispers spread more openly now, curiosity turning into speculation, speculation into unease. Still, Corbin held his silence. But inside, everything was reaching a breaking point. The movements had become stronger. More frequent. No longer subtle enough to ignore. Each shift inside him carried weight, pressure, presence. It wasn't just life. It was development. Progression. Something moving steadily toward an inevitable outcome. And Corbin knew it. He could feel time running out. Not just for his body, but for everything he had come here to do. Because whatever had been set in motion months ago, whatever truth he had buried beneath layers of silence and control, was no longer something he could contain. And soon, whether he was ready or not, it was going to come out. Everything began to collapse the moment Corbin realized he no longer had enough time to keep pretending. By the 6th month, the strain on his body had reached a level that discipline alone could no longer control. The growth had become overwhelming, heavy, rigid, undeniable. Every step demanded effort. Every breath carried pressure. The movements inside him had grown stronger, sharper, more frequent, as if whatever was developing there had its own urgency, its own timeline that refused to slow down. And yet, despite all of that, Corbin kept moving forward with a precision that didn't match his condition. Because beneath the physical burden, there was something else driving him. A purpose. A mission that had started long before the first symptom appeared. The truth about that night. The truth about Captain Thayer Vance and Sergeant Hollis Creed. Corbin had not forgotten. Not completely. What he had told everyone, the accident, the memory loss, the confusion, was only part of the story. Enough to be believable. Enough to lower suspicion. But not enough to reveal what really happened. Fragments of that night had returned slowly, like pieces of something his mind had tried to protect him from. At first, they came as flashes, images without context, sensations without explanation. Then, gradually, they connected. The office. The open drawer. The documents. Numbers that didn't match. Transfers that didn't belong. Funds redirected into accounts that had nothing to do with military operations. It wasn't a mistake. It was systematic. Controlled. Ongoing. Corbin had seen too much. And they had known it. The moment they walked in and found him holding those papers, everything changed. There had been no hesitation in their reaction. No attempt to deny it. Only a shift, calculated, immediate, from concealment to elimination. The strike had come fast. Pain. Darkness. Silence. And then the water. The memory of it returned in fragments. The cold, the weight, the disorientation as the current pulled him under. He had been left there to disappear, to be erased without evidence, without questions. But he didn't disappear. He survived. How, even now, remained unclear in his own mind. Instinct, chance, something deeper that refused to let go. He had fought his way back to the surface, barely conscious, barely alive. The current had carried him far enough to escape immediate detection, but not far enough to make recovery easy. By the time he reached solid ground, he was no longer the same. Injured. Disoriented. But alive. And that was enough. Because survival gave him one thing they hadn't accounted for. Time. Time to think. Time to understand. Time to plan. He couldn't go back as himself. Not yet. Not without proof. Not without protection. If he returned openly, they would finish what they had started, this time without mistakes. So he chose a different path. One that required patience, control, and absolute commitment. He would go back. But not as the same man they had tried to kill. From the moment he made that decision, everything that followed became part of a larger strategy. The memory loss was intentional, crafted to disarm suspicion, to create distance between who he had been and who he needed to appear as now. Every hesitation, every gap in recall, every subtle inconsistency was calculated. He wasn't just hiding. He was watching, collecting, waiting. And all the while, his body was changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. At first, he tried to ignore it. The symptoms were inconvenient, distracting, but manageable. He had a mission to complete, and nothing, not even his own physical condition, was going to interfere with that. But the condition didn't stay manageable. It evolved. The nausea deepened. The fatigue intensified. The growth accelerated beyond anything he could rationalize. What had started as discomfort turned into a constant presence, something that demanded attention, something that couldn't be dismissed. At some point, denial stopped working. Corbin knew what it meant. He just refused to accept it. Because if he did, everything would change. And he couldn't afford that. Not yet. The evidence came first. Everything else could wait. That was the logic that kept him moving, even as his body betrayed him more with each passing day. He tracked routines, observed patterns, identified moments when Vance and Creed were careless, when their control slipped just enough to reveal something useful. He memorized schedules, noted discrepancies, and built a mental map of everything they were trying to hide. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clear. The corruption ran deeper than he had first thought. This wasn't just about stolen funds. It was about manipulation, control, and a system that relied on silence to survive. Equipment shortages that had been blamed on logistics. Budget cuts that never reached the field. Decisions that cost lives, all tied back to the same source. Vance and Creed weren't just protecting themselves. They were protecting an entire structure built on deception. And Corbin was now inside it. Closer than anyone else. But that closeness came with a cost. Because the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous his position became. They were watching him. Not constantly. Not obviously. But enough. Their attempts had failed, but their suspicion hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened. They no longer underestimated him. They no longer assumed he was harmless. And that meant time was running out. Corbin felt it in every step. Not just in the weight of his body, not just in the pressure building inside him, but in the narrowing space between action and consequence. He needed proof. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be erased. And he needed it before his condition forced everything into the open. Because once that happened, control would be gone. The mission would end. And whatever truth he had risked everything to uncover might never reach the surface. So he pushed forward. Through pain. Through exhaustion. Through a reality that no longer made sense, but still demanded action. Because the truth was within reach now. And no matter what it cost him, he was going to expose it. By the time the 8th month closed in, everything inside Corbin Voss had reached a point where control was no longer sustainable. His body had become a battlefield between endurance and inevitability. The weight he carried was no longer something he could hide with posture or discipline. It dominated his movement, slowed his reactions, and forced him into a constant state of tension. The shape beneath his uniform was no longer subtle. It was pronounced, undeniable, impossible to explain away with excuses. Every step felt calculated against collapse. The movements inside him had evolved into something far more aggressive. No longer occasional, no longer faint. They came with force now, sharp, deliberate shifts that made his muscles tighten instinctively. Each one carried a message his mind refused to fully accept, but his body understood completely. Time was over. Whatever had been growing inside him was ready. And yet, Corbin wasn't focused on that. Not entirely. Because after months of observation, after weeks of tracking patterns and waiting for the right moment, he finally saw it, the opening he had been preparing for. It came quietly, almost insignificantly. A change in routine. Captain Thayer Vance and Sergeant Hollis Creed, men who had spent months maintaining tight control over their movements, allowed themselves a rare lapse. A scheduled absence. A window where their office, normally secured, monitored, untouchable, would be left unguarded. It wasn't a mistake. It was an opportunity. Corbin recognized it immediately. Everything he had endured, everything he had hidden, everything he had risked, it all led to this moment. There would not be another chance. That night, he prepared with precision. Every movement was deliberate. Every action calculated to avoid attention. He created the illusion of rest, shaping his surroundings to suggest he was where he was expected to be. Darkness became his ally, silence his cover. And then he moved. The pain was already there, constant, pulsing beneath the surface, but he ignored it. He had trained himself for this, conditioned his body to push beyond limits, to function under pressure. The difference now was that the pressure wasn't external. It was inside him. He reached the office without incident. The door wasn't locked. For a fraction of a second, that detail registered as something almost surreal. After everything, the secrecy, the control, the danger, this final barrier had been left open. Corbin stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered. Ordered. Controlled. Deceptively clean. Nothing out of place. Nothing visible that suggested the corruption hidden beneath it. But he knew where to look. The drawer. The same one from that night. He moved quickly, his hands steady despite the tension building in his body. The drawer opened, revealing exactly what he had expected and feared. Documents. Files. Records that confirmed everything. Financial transfers. Account numbers. Names connected to transactions that should never have existed. Evidence of a system built to siphon resources from within, hidden behind layers of authority and silence. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was proof. Corbin didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and began capturing everything. Each page. Each number. Each signature. The camera moved methodically, ensuring nothing was missed, nothing left behind. This was the only chance to secure what he needed. Something that could survive beyond him, beyond whatever happened next. Because deep down, he knew something was about to go wrong. The pain surged suddenly. Stronger than before. Not a gradual build, not a manageable wave. This was sharp, immediate, overwhelming. His body reacted before his mind could process it. Muscles tightened. Breath caught. His hand instinctively pressed against his abdomen as the pressure inside him intensified. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic.
Strukturet.
His entire body stiffened as the realization broke through the last layer of denial. This wasn't just discomfort. This was progression. The beginning of something irreversible. Corbin forced himself to stay focused. The documents came first. The mission came first. He pushed through the pain, finishing the last images, securing the evidence that had cost him everything to obtain. But the moment he lowered the phone, everything shifted. The door opened. Not slowly. Not cautiously. Suddenly. The sound cut through the room like a fracture. Corbin turned, his body already reacting, his instincts firing faster than thought. They were back. Earlier than expected. Captain Vance stepped in first, his presence filling the doorway, his expression shifting instantly from surprise to something far colder. Behind him, Sergeant Creed followed, his posture tightening as the situation became clear. They saw everything. The open drawer. The documents. The phone still in Corbin's hand. For a split second, time froze. Then it snapped forward. The tension in the room changed instantly, from exposure to confrontation. There was no attempt to hide it anymore. No effort to maintain control through subtlety. This was the end of the illusion. Corbin didn't wait. His body was already at its limit, pain building in waves that were becoming harder to suppress, but none of that mattered now. Instinct took over. Survival. Escape. He moved. Fast. Faster than his condition should have allowed. The desk became an obstacle, a barrier thrown between him and them in a single motion. Papers scattered, objects shifted, anything to break their line of pursuit. The room descended into chaos as he forced his way toward the exit. Behind him, movement exploded into action. They weren't hesitating. They had already made their decision. And this time, they weren't going to fail. Corbin reached the hallway, his body screaming under the strain, each step pushing him closer to collapse. The pain inside him surged again, stronger, more frequent, more urgent. His breathing became uneven, his vision narrowing as the pressure built beyond control. But he kept moving. Because stopping wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit, silent except for the sound of his own movement and the pursuit closing in behind him. Every second mattered. Every step was a fight between endurance and collapse. And then, another wave hit. Stronger than anything before. His body faltered. For a fraction of a second, control slipped. The realization became undeniable. Whatever was inside him was no longer waiting. It was coming. Now. Everything collided at once. By the time Corbin Voss reached the hospital doors, his body was no longer something he could command. It was something he was trying to survive. The pain had escalated beyond endurance, beyond control, beyond anything that could be hidden. Each contraction tore through him with increasing force, bending his frame, breaking his rhythm, dragging him toward a moment he had spent months trying to delay. And still, even then, he didn't stop. Because he had done what he came to do. The evidence was secured. The truth was no longer trapped inside him. But his body was. Inside the operating room, the illusion that had held everything together finally shattered. Under the harsh white lights, with time collapsing into urgency, the reality that had been buried beneath layers of deception surfaced all at once. The uniform, the identity, the silence. It all broke apart under the pressure of what was happening physically. Corbin Voss was never who everyone believed. Beneath the name, beneath the role, beneath the months of calculated control, there was someone else. Coralie Voss. The twin. The one who had taken his place. The one who had stepped into danger knowing exactly what it would cost. Everything that had seemed impossible suddenly aligned with a brutal kind of logic. The body. The changes. The growth. The movements that had defied explanation. It was never a violation of biology. It was a deception strong enough to withstand it. Coralie had entered the base already carrying the truth inside her. 2 lives growing in silence while she carried out a mission that demanded absolute concealment. Every symptom she had hidden, every moment of weakness she had suppressed, every calculated movement had been part of a balancing act between survival and exposure. And now, there was no balance left. The contractions came harder, faster, leaving no space between them. Her body had reached its limit, and there was no delaying what came next. The medical team moved with urgency, their shock replaced by instinct, their confusion overridden by the undeniable reality of the situation. This was no longer a mystery. This was a birth. Outside the operating room, everything else unraveled just as violently. Mercer Hale stood caught between disbelief and realization, his mind racing to connect pieces that no longer fit the version of reality he had been holding on to. The friend he had trusted, the soldier he had defended, the man he thought he knew. None of it had been false, but none of it had been complete. Before he could process it, the tension escalated again. Captain Thayer Vance and Sergeant Hollis Creed arrived. They moved with urgency, with anger, with the kind of desperation that only comes when control has been lost. They weren't there to understand what had happened. They were there to stop it, from spreading, from being exposed, from reaching anyone beyond those walls. But they were already too late. Because the final piece of the truth had arrived with them. The real Corbin Voss. He entered the hospital supported by sheer will, his body still bearing the damage of what had been done to him months before. The limp, the scar, the exhaustion. It was all there, undeniable, impossible to fake. And with him came clarity. Everything that had been hidden snapped into place. The attack. The attempt to erase him. The decision Coralie had made to step into his place. The months of infiltration. The evidence. All of it now existed outside of secrecy. The system that Vance and Creed had relied on, silence, control, fear, collapsed under the weight of exposure. Because Coralie had already ensured it would. The files she had captured were no longer in her possession alone. They had been transmitted, secured, placed into channels that could not be intercepted or erased. The corruption they had built their power on was no longer contained within a single office or a single base. It was visible, traceable, unavoidable. In the operating room, the first cry cut through everything. Sharp, clear, alive. It broke the tension like a fracture, forcing every person present to confront what had been building beneath the surface for months. A second cry followed soon after, reinforcing the reality that had once seemed impossible. 2 lives. 2 undeniable truths. At the same moment, outside those walls, the final collapse began. Authority shifted. Control changed hands. The men who had once dictated outcomes found themselves stripped of it, their position reversed, their certainty gone. The structure they had manipulated no longer protected them. It exposed them. What they had tried to bury had come back stronger. Not just surviving. Proving. And at the center of it all, Coralie lay exhausted but unbroken. She had carried more than just the physical weight of those months. She had carried risk, deception, pain, and a mission that demanded everything from her. She had walked into danger knowing there would be no easy way out, no guarantee of survival, no certainty that the truth would ever surface. But she had done it anyway. Because some things couldn't be ignored. Some truths demanded to be revealed, no matter the cost. And now, as the cries of her children filled the room, that cost had been paid. Not in silence. Not in failure. But in something far stronger. Proof. Justice. And life that refused to be erased.